Minister Hajdu, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thanks for having me on.
Right, now I noticed you had this press conference yesterday about the judicial review, and you have said a number of times that you want to start flowing this money, obviously, as quickly as possible. So why not just maybe listen to what the CHRT has to say and just start flowing the money?
Well, that is actually the plan, where two things can be true. So we have an agreement with the parties that we will begin to compensate, and we're on a path to figuring out how to do that right now for children that were systemically discriminated and harmed through a systemically racist policy and approach. But there are questions, in fact, that AFN also has around the CHRT's decision. There's also a deadline to file a judicial review 30 days after a decision. So we took this move so that we could, first of all, have time to get the entire decision from the CHRT. We don't only have the summary decision. But secondly, to ask some important questions of the federal court around really a historic agreement, a final settlement agreement that was Indigenous-led and supported by all the parties. So I'm confident that we have a good foundation for the beginning of the compensation process, but I think these questions are important to ask the court.
Right, and I guess I just want to ask you a bit specifically about that. What is it you exactly want the courts to review about the CHRT's latest statement, I guess, and what do you hope they find?
Well, I think our lawyers have questions around the decision, the summary decision, as I said, that overturns really an agreement that is historic, that was negotiated with Indigenous people. The compensation regime that was planned and presented in the final settlement agreement was designed by First Nations people. And it had the full support of all the parties that were litigating. And so this is an unusual space. Usually, I'm no lawyer, but my understanding is that courts appreciate when parties work out a solution together. And so one of the questions that's in our statement or our request for judicial review is around a decision by the tribunal that would overturn this collaborative approach with the government and the parties involved. And I will say this, a lot of work went into that final settlement agreement. I think Canadians know that, and Indigenous First Nations people know that. It took well over a year to get there. It was meticulously thought through by especially the First Nations partners, who had a very specific view about how compensation should flow. And it is in some ways, well, it is historic, because it is the compensation approach is designed by First Nations people. So, there's a lot there to work with. The government is still firmly committed to compensating children who were harmed. And indeed, as I said, we'll be working with the parties on how we begin that compensation as soon as possible and finding that pathway.
Right, and I guess we've heard different numbers, but how many children and families roughly does this the agreement you have with the AFN and other parties cover?
Well, it covers thousands of children, and I don't have an exact number for you right now, but it's many, many children that were harmed. This action, this legal action, is a reflection of the kinds of discrimination that many First Nations people will tell you that they faced in their lives, and children being removed from homes through a system that oftentimes was penalizing poverty and other kinds of outcomes of colonization. And so it's thousands of people. Children, we say children, but children that were harmed for over 30 years through this system of discrimination. There's another piece to this work, as you know, and that is reforming the system. And we've got some good foundations and some really promising work that's happening in some First Nations communities, but it's a lot of work and a lot of, I would say, a lot of rethinking and unlearning bad behavior by colonizing departments to transform systems. And so that work is continuing on how to transform a system of care to be First Nations led. I think the legislation C-92, which is about enabling First Nations to take back control, is a huge piece of it. I think equitable funding for First Nations family and child services is another huge piece. But it's also about transforming the way that we conceptualize supporting families and children. And I've seen some really phenomenal examples of that transformation happening across the country. it's still in pockets, and we need it to be broader.
Right. Okay. And I know that the AFN has quoted us as many as 300,000 children and families. Is it possible it is that high? Or
It could be, yes. And as I said, I don't have the number on hand here, but yes, it's thousands and thousands of individuals that were removed from care, placed in ISC funded settings, Indigenous Services Canada settings without their family or without their culture in many cases. And when we talk about intergenerational harm, we often talk about residential schools, but the child welfare system also perpetuates intergenerational harm in that children who have been removed from care, removed from their families, removed from their culture, and sometimes, many times, removed from their communities, are islands in a way, and often have a really hard time finding home. And it's actually really tragic when you meet people who have no memory of who they belong to. And who are their people.
Right, and I know that your agreement actually goes back further than the original CHRT. You're covering children and families back to 91. I think theirs started at 2006, so you've changed the parameters as you know. It seemed to be, maybe in some of your statements yesterday, maybe I'm off or that, but that is the belief that the federal government believes it's covering all the children that it was responsible for, but that perhaps CHRT has maybe found its response, that it's talking about children that weren't in the care of the federal government at that time, or not responsible, perhaps of the provinces. Is that the issue?
Well, there are some questions around those findings by those, I suppose, rulings by the CHRT. But primarily right now, the judicial review is focused on the legitimacy of the legal decision to not accept a negotiated agreement. And again, I go back to how historic this is and how transformational this will be for the families affected. Look, I think there are many, many ways that Indigenous people were discriminated against and are discriminated against, and the Government of Canada needs to lean in and to change those systems that are systemically discriminatory. But in this case, I am profoundly aware of the amount of work that went into this agreement by AFN, by Mashum and Trout and many others that contributed to ensuring that the compensation regime would be fair, that it would be sensitive, that it would not cause onward harm. And I really appreciated that, because although I wasn't a politician at the time, I was working in amongst Indigenous communities when the settlements for residential schools started to unfold in this country. And for some people it was life-changing in a positive way, and for some people it was devastating. And the relitigation of trauma that some individuals had to go through in order to get independent assessment payments was extremely damaging. And so I, in my mind, remembered those stories and the people that I met that shared them with me, and I was profoundly grateful that it was Indigenous people, First Nations people, designing this package so that it would be safer for people trying to access compensation. And I know that seems odd, doesn't it? That getting compensation can cause harm. But it can cause harm if it's done in a way that's traumatizing and re-victimizing. And so I was very appreciative to the First Nations partners for taking the lead in that design.
Okay, fair enough. And if the courts do come back, though, and say that they actually agree CHRT is right and the government's wrong in its interpretation, will you go back to the negotiating table?
Yes, and in fact, I would say that we're always willing to work with the parties on a consensual approach to resolving differences. This has got to be the way forward for Canada. I mean, we've got to stop using the courts as a way to settle our disagreements, and I think that's why, although this came about because of legal action, I think that's why the settlement agreement is so historic, is that it was negotiated, it was agreed upon, all parties agreed with the approach. But having said that, always willing to sit down with the parties to find a consensual way through the questionable areas.
Does that include, though, opening up the compensation amount or going beyond the $20 billion?
Well, at this point, we're confident that the $20 billion will suffice, but listen, I'm always interested in hearing non-litigant ways to get to an agreement that aren't that doesn't involve litigation. I think reconciliation is about trying to find a path forward together. I think what's should be an indication for your viewers and for the listeners of the seriousness of the government's intent, and I think the growing trust between the government and the parties is that, in fact, as you know, AFN has asked for a judicial review of this decision as well. I've made it very clear to Regional Chief Woodhouse that we'll continue to work together on not just how to flow this compensation for the areas that we agree, but how we get through these areas of uncertainty as well.
Right, and I guess just moving away now to another issue, of course, emergency preparedness and First Nations. Auditor General was flagged in a report last week, and of course, I think found roughly 3 times the amount of money is being spent on reacting to these natural disasters and First Nations communities as to preparing for them. How is it, just very quickly, that your department plans to, I guess, resolve this situation?
Right. First of all, fully agree with the Auditor General. And if you've traveled anywhere in the north in particular, but really throughout many different communities, I think of the East Coast and the vulnerability of erosion, for example, and high winds, you quickly see how rapidly climate change is changing things and putting communities at risk. The Auditor General found that while the department was good and spent enormous amounts of money on supporting communities that were experiencing a climate-related emergency or other emergencies, that the department did not spend enough energy and time on the prevention piece, the resiliency piece, and indeed that a number of projects went unfunded. And so what that means to me is that, like many other departments, our department has to pivot from and actually do 2 things at once, because we can't stop responding to the crisis. Obviously, the communities need you, they need certain supports, and it's a very expensive proposition when there's a crisis, but it is all hands on deck. But while we're doing that, we have to figure out how we're also going to spend the sufficient resources as a government to protect communities, to help communities with their plans for adaptability or all the different kinds of work that the communities need to do to reinforce themselves against these kinds of escalating risks. And I think that's an incredibly important finding, and it's an indication that those members of Parliament or those other legislators that are saying that we don't need to do anything on climate is a ridiculous proposition when you visit communities that are, year after year in peril of forest fires or tremendous flooding. I think about Peguis in Manitoba, and they can't catch a break. Just as they start to rebuild homes, and people are sometimes waiting years and years to come home, another extreme weather event knocks those people and more out of those homes. This can't continue. So my job now as Minister of Indigenous Services is to make a compelling case to my colleagues, and obviously I'll be focused on Budget 2022 to ensure that we have sufficient resources to support communities as they do this really important work. These are life and death situations, and they are also really hard decisions to make for communities. Some communities talk about whether or not they will need to move. If you're in a floodplain and it's never going to get better, but those, as you know, are complicated decisions, and then tie into things like additions to reserve, which are also very complicated things. But the time is now to start thinking about how we're going to, as a country, as nations, make ourselves more resilient for the kinds of extreme weather we're seeing.
Okay, and then quickly as a last question, one of my colleagues was at a meeting, I'm not sure where it was exactly, but where the AFN said there's roughly $4 billion in sort of shovel-ready projects ready to go. Didn't give too much information more than that, but did you want to expand on that at all, or maybe sort of fill us in on what projects these may be?
I wouldn't be able to guess about which projects, but I can tell you that this government is committed to closing the infrastructure gap by 2030. I assume they're talking about the number of different kinds of infrastructure projects. And in fact, we spent historic amounts of money building schools and health centers and housing on First Nations, but the gap is still huge. And so I really can't comment on the amount or the project, but I can tell you that I have no doubt that there are $4 billion worth of shovel-ready projects in this country, and that is exciting because that's an opportunity to actually build the kinds of things that communities need. So that's the work that I do, is to try to, first of all, get the money out the door as quickly as possible. So we have a very good argument to finance that we need more. We say we need to spend every dollar. There's no point in having anything left over. And shovel-ready projects help us do that, because in fact then communities are ready to use that money and they have the plans, and we're not starting from a feasibility study, but rather from an actual plan and a site that's ready, and a community that's ready to go. It's exciting times, actually, and so we have a lot of work to do together, but there's a lot of momentum.
Right, exactly. Well, I'll have to end it there, but thanks very much again for joining us, Mr. Hajdu, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.